Thank you so much. Good afternoon and welcome to the Council on Economic Expansion. This meeting is being held remotely due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021 allows us to hold remote meetings during the pandemic because an in-person meeting or meeting conducted under Section 13D.02 is not practical or prudent because of a health pandemic or an emergency declared under Chapter 12. I hope this is one of the last times in our meetings that we have to make this announcement. It would be great to be back together again as soon as possible, and we'll keep everyone posted on plans for being able to meet in person. As we all look to our declining COVID cases, we would all love to just look forward to spring, but now we must also acknowledge the invasion of Ukraine as we send our love and hopes for peace to the Ukrainian people. Commissioner Grove, I believe you have an announcement about the just released February forecast.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Armstead. Before we turn it over to our co-chairs, just wanted to address the fact that I think as we speak, the governor and Commissioner Showalter and others are addressing the press and the public about the forecast. If you've been checking your news feeds, you've seen the good news, which is another $1.5 billion in the government in our government's surplus based on this February forecast. And just a little context here, every fall in November and every kind of midwinter in February of these budget years, we have our MMB department and state economists take a look at the economic conditions at play and estimate the surplus or in some years deficit that we face from a budgetary standpoint. And due to higher incomes, higher spending, higher profits, we have an improved forecast in February, which means that $7.7 billion we spoke of last fall is now grown to $9.3 billion of a surplus. So that's good news, full stop. No question, it is good news and will certainly influence the legislative discussions that we're having right now. We continue to be advocating for so many of the principles that this council advised the governor to consider for ARPA spending. And I think it'll be a great discussion amongst commissioners here in the governor's office in the coming weeks about how we might expand some of those proposals or include those that weren't originally in the package. Nothing to share there yet, but I just wanted to convey to this group we are going to be having those conversations. You know, obviously, as Jody mentioned, we're all closely watching the tragedy unfolding in the Ukraine, and we know that those geopolitical risks will have an effect on how legislators and the governor think about the surplus and think about our state's economic standing and issues around inflation and other economic variables we're all tracking will influence this too. But we are excited to see that forecast look strong. And I'll drop in the chat just a link to the MMB's materials on this so you can see some of the details if you're interested in it. We'll all be watching this closely. And if there's need to circle back with this group in the coming weeks on this front, we'll do so as well. So just wanted to share that. It was a timely update given this is happening, you know, as we speak here in our council meeting, and eager to move forward and take this good news and turn it into something good for the state. So with that, I'll turn it over to our co-chairs and we can begin the real meeting.
Well, thank you to both of you commissioners, and I want to welcome the council. We might as well pop up the agenda slide maybe for today, and we'll give everybody a sense of what we're going to go through in this next 2-hour session. So we'll start with, we have 3 folks with us today. One of them is our own Juhi, but we'll have three speakers who are going to provide our insight talks for the day. We're going to have a little bit of a panel and have a chance to ask them some questions. I have a couple for them, and then the rest of the group is welcome to do that as well. We will break out after that into small group discussions. I think 3 groups is what we're looking for at that point, just to talk about what we heard and how to integrate that into the roadmap. And then we're going to go into subcommittee time. We're going to show everyone what the subcommittees look like based on all of your input. And the subcommittees will then have a chance to go into their own breakouts. And today's focus will be on finalizing vision statements, looking at the meeting schedule and noticing which one you're in charge of, because each of the subcommittees will be in charge of one of the upcoming 5 meetings, and also talking about engagement planning. So with that, we'll go ahead to our insight talk. Our insight talk is aimed at understanding other approaches and frameworks for the 10-year economic planning cycle in the state of Minnesota here. Our presenters here today are Quaylen Ellengrood from McKinsey, our own Juhi Pamplun from the Alliance, and Craig McDonald from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I have extensive bios on all of them, but I think it might be more efficient if we just sort of let them kind of give a quick intro when they are up. Where we've asked them each to kind of do a 5-minute sort of overview of their thoughts. And so we'll start with Quaylen on that and go then with the next two.
Great. Hello, I'm Quaylen Ellengrud from McKinsey & Company. I'm a senior partner and a director of McKinsey Global Institute. I thought I might share some of the data and insights that we've pulled together both across the state, and then we can actually drill down and model at an MSA specific level, so can get quite specific into Minneapolis-St. Paul or other MSAs across the state. And a few different insights that we've seen as we pull together our Black economic mobility work, some of our American Opportunity Survey work, our Women in the Workplace survey, and then the Future of Work, which looks at the impact of automation across industries and occupations. And given we just have 5 minutes, I probably won't go through any pages, but I'm happy to kind of share some of the insights on paper after today's conversation. I'll just hit a couple of the highlights that we have overall. I think what we've seen in this pandemic is it has affected different groups very differently, of course. It has affected everybody deeply, but both by gender and race in particular, it's been particularly impactful. We've now kind of recovered from a GDP perspective. From a jobs perspective, Minnesota is still at about 75% of pre-COVID levels or so, but that's very different by race. If you look at the US workforce overall, actually male workforce numbers are up by about 100,000 compared to 2 years ago, compared to pre-COVID. But in terms of women, we're about 1 million fewer women in the workforce compared to pre-COVID. So very different effect there. If you look by race, more Black workers and more Hispanic workers have also exited. I also wanted to share, in our own kind of Twin Cities area, we also had pre-COVID racial disparities. Those have been exacerbated, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of savings and other levels through COVID. So pre-COVID, we had huge discrepancy in median family income, in poverty rate, right? 25% of our Black residents compared to 6% of our white residents in poverty before COVID. And then the unemployment rate jumping by about 2 to 3 times for Black residents and about 2 times for white residents, but off very different baselines, about 2 to 1 in that baseline. So now 18% or so for Black residents, 7% or so after the initial outbreak, of course, now going down to pretty low numbers in terms of overall unemployment, but that is very unevenly distributed. I also wanted to share the effect of automation, and what we've done through McKinsey Global Institute is bottom-up modeled what could be automated today based on 2 factors. Number one, what technology exists today so that kind of tactically we can automate the work. And number 2, based on the wages of the people doing that work, those activities, does it make business sense to actually automate that work? And when you bring those 2 things together, you have a very detailed future of work automation model that we've built. We've built that based on the underlying activities of 800 different occupations, taken that down across the United States to the MSA level. And what we see basically is that about 40% of activities on average can be automated, but that differs pretty dramatically by occupation. It is about 10% for legislators, psychiatrists, CEOs. It's more like 90 or 100% for sewing machine operators, assembly line workers, even travel agents. On average, though, it's about 40%, but that kind of shakes out differently across different occupations. 60%, almost 2/3 of the occupations, have about 1/3 of the work that could be automated away today, and it would make business sense to do so. Now, what we did in our modeling is we took that baseline automation future of work model, and we combined it with COVID-19. And what you see is what was already a pretty quickly moving automation trend dramatically accelerated with COVID-19. So in some occupations alone, office assistants, for example, even some areas of manufacturing, we see 1 million job loss due to COVID alone. So those 2 things moving together, very much affecting the same groups as the automation trend line had already been affecting. We also see when you put those 2 things together, bigger kind of gainers and losers in terms of different industries and occupations. The occupations that are looking to grow dramatically are things like health aides, healthcare workers, health professionals, STEM professionals, as well as transportation services. And this would include warehouses, delivery, all of that. Those jobs are big gainers and going to be growing quite a bit. And the overlay of COVID has significantly grown those jobs even further than automation alone. We also, though, have a number of occupations that are biggest losers. So office support, primarily administrative assistants, are going to shrink by about 17%, an additional million or so jobs lost due to COVID-19. Customer service and sales shrinking by 8%, an additional 3+ million jobs lost due to COVID overlay. Food services, so restaurants, bars, etc., 5% job loss there, an additional million jobs lost. And when you put all of that together, it's not just the initial occupations and industries that are affected, but also we're going to need very different skills. And what we've seen bottom up as we're shifting the landscape of skills, activities, and jobs that we're going to have is that very different skills are going to be needed in the jobs of the future. On average, those jobs require a higher average education. That's why you see a real disconnect in our labor force today of a lot of job openings. But also kind of people looking for those jobs. The people looking for the jobs typically don't have the right level of education or training that the significant number of 3+ million job openings require. And the skills that we're going to need are much more technological skills in the future. Not, can I code, but can I interact effectively with technology to be effective? And number 2, social and emotional skills. We're going to need much more of that versus physical and manual education or physical and manual labor or basic cognitive skills like problem solving. Overall, I'll maybe wrap us up with, we also looked at economic recovery, both in the Twin Cities and across the state. And what we find is that while male employment has already recovered, female employment will take about 9 or so months after male employment to recover. Race is about equal, interestingly, but that's very bimodal. So for Black workers, many of them are in frontline jobs where there has been a lot of job growth. Others are in customer service and sales, office support, those administrative assistants. And so it's very bimodal, much more likely for a Black worker to be both in an occupation that is gaining jobs, as well as in an occupation that is losing jobs. So much more of a bimodal effect there for many Black workers. There's also a huge discrepancy by level of education. So job recovery for those with a high school degree or less is about 6+ months slower than everybody else in the economy. And if you already make $40,000 or less, about 9 months slower than if you are making $70,000 or more. So a very unequal recovery to this. We also have kind of views by across the state, by kind of different areas within the Twin Cities, and I'm happy to kind of share that with you afterwards. I'll maybe wrap us up by saying there's lots of different levers I think you could consider. There's actions employers can certainly take here on reskilling, on retraining, on keeping an eye out for what are the jobs that I'm going to need in the future so I can retain my own workers today in a very competitive job environment to train them for future jobs that I'm going to need. Higher ed leaders collaborating with kind of policymakers, but also employers. And then for policymakers, I think thinking proactively about what, given the surplus that you just described, but also infrastructure bills and other spending, what are the actions that we're taking today that are going to further exacerbate the gaps that we already have by race, by income, by education? And how could we use some of these levers, whether they're requirements around grants, other funding, and targeted kind of strategies and levers to close those gaps in a much faster way? So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you very much. Juhi, why don't you go next?
Okay. Hi, I'm Juhi. I'm with the executive director actually for the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. And so it's my understanding that I was asked to kind of help to inform you on how the Alliance put together our regional agenda. And so I will not be data driven because that is not what we do, though we do work with data. and I cut and pasted it into the chat, but for some reason it's only going one letter at a time, so it's going to be very tall. Okay, so again, Juhi with the Alliance, and the Alliance is a coalition of community-based organizations and advocacy groups building shared power to advance strategic campaigns around the intersections of racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and health equity. And our mission is to advance justice and equity and economic growth and land development in the Twin Cities region. So we are very embedded in the concept of justice clearly, which is really about bringing not just benefits, but really kind of rectifying the wrongs of the past, right? And so we have an agenda called Our Area, which is the weirdly placed link in the chat. That was a culmination of conversations that the Alliance convened, not entirely intentionally to create this agenda, but because there was an opportunity to create an agenda around important issues to our communities. And the reason that it's an important document for the Alliance is because we are such a multi-issue organization, and we strongly believe that, just as people are not just monolithic, that our communities are not monolithic. And so it is really important for us to always be talking about all the issues that are impacting individuals and communities in order to thrive and for a more vibrant community and Twin Cities region. And so we, in the work, we start with the root causes of the issues, which I think, many people would agree you always want to start with the root causes. And for us, the root causes really are in that historic and ongoing violence of patriarchy, colonialism, and white supremacy that's embedded within our systems. And so that's what we really work to target within the work. So when we're talking about tenant protections and tenant rights, when we're talking about investment in our BIPOC small businesses, when we're talking about transit lines, we are really working to right the wrongs of this historic and ongoing patriarchy and white supremacy in our systems. And so in the center of that then are the communities that we believe are most impacted by that history, and that is the Black, Indigenous, immigrant, Asian, African, and Latinx communities here in the Twin Cities. And so with our area, when we convened these discussions, we really honed in on the specific areas of our lives that Alliance tends to focus on, which is community engagement and voice, or ownership, housing, economic development, transit, environmental justice, community safety, and then also how do we sustain ourselves as people in the work, as people who are also part of these communities that have been impacted by all these issues. And so with these conversations, it's a monthly series we have called Actualizing Equity, which the Alliance has a history of doing organizer roundtables where organizers come around and talk about the issues. And then a few years ago, we wanted to be more intentional about not only talking about equity in our communities, but how are people actually actualizing it? How are we making it happen, operationalizing what we're talking about? And so that's the intention behind Actualizing Equity. And so with that, we are very intentional about who we bring into that space to have these conversations and to lead the conversations. And so we work to make sure that, one, those organizations that we work with and partner with are truly deeply embedded in the communities that they work with and are also most impacted by these systems and issues. And so so an organization that just superficially is connected to the community because they transactionally do services for a community, but don't really get to know and work to build power within those communities, those are not necessarily the people we work with. We're working with those organizations that really are deeply invested in the greater community, and not just an individual getting connected to a specific service. And so then we also are very mindful in bringing in not only the perspective of our Alliance members. Alliance, again, we're kind of a coalition-based organization, so we have 33 organizational members, but we understand that that's a small universe of voices. And so we also work to be very intentional about who we're inviting and who is really leading and kind of on the edge of this work that we all can learn from and follow. And so we bring those voices into the conversation as well. And then in 2021, we also brought in artists, which were, hugely impactful. I know a lot of you all probably bring that into your work too. But if you look at the agenda, you'll see some of the artist pieces, and it allows you to connect to the issues at a completely different level than even listening to a personal story, right? Or the data we just heard, which are all important aspects to change. And so then, so those were kind of the elements that make up the agenda. And then the actual creation then of the agenda, I think, again, what the Alliance really works towards is that we completely value and trust that those most impacted both understand the current situation, not just like their own situation, but the systems that they have to interact with. A person who is on, public assistance, like they know the system more, in and out better than most any of us here, right? And so we understand that and we trust that. And so therefore, we trust that they also know the most meaningful solutions to the challenges of those issues, right? And so those people that are losing jobs to automation, we would trust that they know what the best way to keep them in the labor force would be, right? And so we would listen to them. And so that's, I think, kind of the values behind the agenda that the Alliance created. And just because the woman before me offered some, kind of how to move forward with this kind of comments, I'll just say that in the document, you will see that a lot of the recommendations end up with intentional investments, right? And that is what this council is all about. I think we've been having fantastic conversations, very intentional conversations about equity, about white supremacy and how that's impacted certain communities here in Minnesota. And I feel like we need to be carrying that forward into how we create those recommendations and how we ask the state to spend its money. So.
Thank you, Juhi. Our final introduction will be from Craig McDonald from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
Thank you. My name is Craig McDonald, and I serve as an Assistant Commissioner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Air and Climate Policy. And I'm here today to provide a little bit of an update on the state's draft climate action framework and the process that we've been developing and using to build that document. So I'll start with a little bit about on the framework background, some of the goals, and then talk a little bit about the engagement process that we are utilizing to finalize that document. So the Governor's Climate Change Subcabinet released a draft of the Minnesota's Climate Action Framework on February 1st of this year. And the Climate Action Framework is a document that sets a vision for how our state will address and prepare for climate change, and it's being developed in collaboration with the Governor's Advisory Council on Climate Change. It identifies immediate near-term actions that we must take to achieve our long-term goal of building a carbon-neutral, resilient, and equitable future for Minnesota. The framework builds on years of engagement with Minnesotans on the issue of climate change, and staff from Minnesota's state agencies developed the draft of this framework using their expertise, analysis, and public input collected throughout 2021. The framework is comprised of 6 key goals, and those goal areas are clean transportation, climate smart natural and working lands, resilient communities, clean energy and efficient buildings, healthy lives and communities, and a clean economy. While some of these goals are more clearly linked to the work of this council, each of these objectives is intrinsically tied to the success of Minnesota's economy. When we think about resilient communities, Minnesota's small businesses cannot thrive if they face the threat of flooding every spring and summer. So there are measures in this plan to upgrade our stormwater infrastructure to ensure our communities are prepared for more intense and frequent rainfalls that we can expect with Minnesota's changing climate. Climate smart management of our natural and working lands is also a significant economic opportunity for our state. This framework recognizes the opportunity to invest in new markets and supply chains for crops that keep carbon in our soil, and for wood products that increase carbon storage and replace fossil fuels. We also need to find transportation solutions that will get Minnesota's workforce from point A to point B while making significant reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions. Our goal is to reduce these emissions from Minnesota's transportation sector 30% by 2025 and 80% by 2050. And these are the goals of the Next Generation Energy Act that was passed in 2007. In order to meet these goals for the transportation sector, We will need significant investments in public transit and our electric vehicle infrastructure and biofuels, all of which translates into economic opportunity. And our sixth framework goal, the clean economy, really focuses on building an economy that is based in sustainability that will reduce existing inequities. To achieve this goal, we will need public and private investment in emerging research, technology, and businesses, as well as collaboration with labor groups and educational institutions to ensure Minnesotans have the skills to fill in-demand jobs. In practice, this framework calls for the development of a clean economy jobs workforce development plan for Minnesota by 2023 that explains how we will connect workers to sustainable job opportunities in and beyond the energy sector. It will also include increasing enrollment in building and construction trades apprenticeship programs and increasing the number of women and people of color that complete these programs. The framework acknowledges the need to support existing power plant host communities with planning and implementation strategies for a successful transition and a just transition. Research and development is also a critical component of this goal area. We can grow clean economy businesses and jobs through innovation and partnership with tribal nations, universities, commercial consortiums, private research labs, and public support. And so how we will finalize this plan is built on a robust engagement plan. In order for the framework to be successful, it has to reflect the real experiences and aspirations of all Minnesotans. We've released a draft of the framework for public input because the solutions to our problems can only be found when we work together. We know that every Minnesotan in each of our businesses has a role in addressing climate change. We know that government cannot do it alone. So throughout the winter and spring of 2022, state agencies will be continuing conversations with Minnesotans about the framework. We want to understand how the priorities in this plan align with the needs of our businesses and communities. Work groups are now being convened in each of the framework goal areas to garner feedback from a broad universe of stakeholders. These conversations will occur throughout the spring with the hopes of publishing our draft climate action framework in mid-2022. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate the introductory comments from all three of you. So I have a few questions for you, and then we're going to turn the group loose to ask questions if that's okay with you. First question is, given the ideas that you've shared with us today, could you identify like one change or strategy that you feel would best accelerate economic growth in the next 5 years in Minnesota?
I'm happy to start, and others please jump in. I think one of the biggest underused levers is getting more women back into the workforce, given the 1 million missing women that we were just describing. And the last 2 years, we've made such negative progress. So to me, it would be tying award of spending bills and other state kind of funded contracts to companies that are either reskilling very proactively or providing childcare or addressing the other barriers that are keeping so many of the women out of the workplace right now.
Would you identify reskilling and childcare as the two most significant impediments?
Reskilling is more of a barrier to get better jobs in the future. Childcare, certainly. Another cited barrier would be healthcare and sort of broad provided healthcare benefits, even for part-time workers, would be some of the three top of my list.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think about stability. I think the fact that an individual, a family needs stability for education, for employment, for their health. And so I think the housing crisis is essential to address, and people's access to affordable but also dignified housing. And then with that, I think, the conversations we've been having around mental health, I would say, not just mental health, but holistic health.
On the climate side, I would say there's real opportunity by continuing to develop policies and investments related to clean energy deployment. Minnesota has 55,000 individuals who are already working in the clean energy economy. And prior to 2020, that development of those jobs outpaced normal job growth by 3 times. So it's really an opportunity here to get more folks involved in that clean energy economy. And I think there's just incredible benefits outside of job creation with that. We know that the cleaner our grid, the better that is for reducing carbon emissions. And thinking about how we continue to incentivize efficiency programs as well. So it's about having the cleanest energy possible and using less of it. Those are just kind of win-wins for the economy and the environment.
Okay, great. Thank you. How would each of you prioritize and center equity and community engagement in your area of expertise? And this is obviously very front and center in what Juhi does, but if you have an added element of focus that you want to provide, that'd be great as well.
I'll start with this one. And thank you to Liz for dropping the draft climate action framework into the chat. If you click on that link, you'll see the 6 goal sections there, and each of the sections actually discusses equity. So each of the action teams that led the development of that section was asked to think about specifically what are the strategies that the state needs to think about in order to ensure that we have a just and equitable transition to a clean energy economy, as well as developing some of those cross-cutting areas. As I mentioned before, one of the sections itself is actually about healthy lives and communities and how we can think about the disproportionate impacts of just pollution in our regulatory system there and the opportunities in confronting climate change and the climate crisis and trying to eliminate some of those disproportionate impacts. Whether if that's incentivizing more folks into the clean energy economy for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or just thinking about what are the health impacts related to climate change on frontline communities.
I would approach it in 2 ways. One, I would try to embed as much of it into the how you do the rest of the work as possible so that it's not a separate equity effort. It's more how you do the day-to-day work and embed it into all of the other programs that are happening. And then just being very practical, there are still gaps that are going to exist. And so taking a step back and examining what are the biggest gaps, what are the gaps that are simply not going to be closing by themselves, and then where do you have to have kind of a separate targeted effort to accelerate that closure.
Do you have a particular biggest gap that you've seen in your research in mind that might be an area we should be focusing on?
I personally would say I think reskilling could do a lot for this state, for our community, particularly because I do see a lot of effective partnership across our community, frankly, more than I see in many other areas as I look across the country. And so could we be really at the forefront of partnering between the state, employers, educational institutions to get ahead of the skills that we're going to need for the next 5 to 10 years. And so that for every dollar that we spend on economic development, on acceleration, it's money well spent for decades, as opposed to, oh, it's 5 years and then those jobs are being automated away.
Yeah, and I would just add that authentic engagement where you're very honest about how and where people's voices are going to be used and heard is essential to maintain trust with the community. And then I'm going to put into chat, just because it's something I really love, is that the Alliance has put together a livability principle. So we have the scorecard on equitable development that focuses on, housing and economic development and stuff. But we have this new livability principle that's centered in community power, history, and wellness. And I think, again, to that restorative piece, reparative piece, I think it's really important as you engage communities to think about how what you're doing is doing that.
Thank you. Can any of you highlight some key engagement strategies that you've come across while focusing on your agenda?
I think I would echo what Juhi just said about that authentic engagement. And that means going and having some hard conversations and recognizing that you may not have all the answers and really listening. Through the development of the draft climate action framework and the establishment of the work groups that we are establishing, it's going to mean really kind of focusing on equity and making sure that we're hearing from diverse voices, people who haven't always had a seat at the table, and being prepared to honestly listen to what folks have to say, even if it makes some of us uncomfortable at times.
Thank you, because I love that. Discomfort is part of the work, right? Tension is a huge part of the work. And so when we try to avoid that, we are being insincere or we just aren't ready for the work. And we have to be honest about that too, right? And so, yeah, I'm sure there's other practices too, but I love that. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think just the fact that you raised it means that you're probably far ahead of many others, but getting out there and engaging, it is harder in this environment, right? This kind of teams interaction model by definition will not be equitable. And so how do you kind of get out there, walk in the shoes of the very people who are at the focus of this equity that we're describing and understand what their life is like, what those challenges are, and work that into some of the solutions. Harder now than ever, frankly.
If we needed it, that should be further motivation for our group to find a way to start doing things in person here as we head into the spring. So that's great. Lastly, for me, just our job here in Phase 2 as the Governor's Council on Economic Expansion is to make recommendations focused on equitable economic expansion. Do you have any specific advice for us on that topic as we embark over these next few weeks and months toward that recommendation?
My advice would be bold. This is such a unique moment. And if you are not bold, I think we will be missing an opportunity for decades. This is such a pivotal moment now as we emerge from 2 challenging years. You heard about kind of the surplus, but we're still behind in terms of jobs. If it can kind of bend the curve here and close those gaps in a much faster way, we won't be making backwards progress for the next 5 to 10 years. And so I would encourage you on all of our behalves to be really bold here in terms of the solutions, the creativity. I think we have a very unique state and a lot of assets here to build on. I think there's all the room in the world to be kind of at the forefront of what can be done across this country.
I would say that just continue to have conversations with folks like us who are working in different areas, right? Because there's so much need to engage and think about how your work dovetails with climate change, environmental regulation, other opportunities that I work into. And so just making sure that conversations are not siloed and being held in a vacuum is important here.
Yeah, I love the bold statement, so I'm just going to let her keep that.
Great. I'm now going to open it up, and I see the first hand I see is my co-chair, Paul Williams. So how about it, Paul?
I know. Completely surprised at that, right, Jeff? So first of all, thank each of you. Really, really good stuff. And I'm especially in this second phase of our work, where the governor and the lieutenant governor have asked us to think about what needs to change really to drive long-term economic growth. And each of you actually have talked certainly about investments, right? And really doubling down in a number of areas. Juhi, you talked about kind of core, stability, right? Issues of stability. Colin, you talked about a number of different kind of workforce strategies, women in the workforce in particular. I would agree with you there. Craig, you talked about, clean energy jobs. I'm also interested in, and again, each of you referenced this, but the systems change. So part of the problem in Minnesota, I think, is actually we throw money at stuff all the time, right? But we don't change some of the underlying systems that, in fact, I think get in our way in any one of these categories or multiple categories of work. So if you were to kind of highlight one change in the systems, right, that each of you are referencing, working on, thinking about, what is that one change, right, in the system? Trying to think Quellen, just an example, you talked about collaborations amongst colleges. That's a system that isn't necessarily working very well, but do each of you have another or a good example of a change in the systems that we need to see take place to really drive economic growth?
I'll mention 2 others. One is, I think, even deeper collaboration. We've got a great foundation, but deeper collaboration between government, state government, and potentially broader federal, and employers. And I think there's a lot more potential there through alignment, agreeing on kind of general direction, reskilling, retraining at scale, but in a more coordinated way so that we're all headed in the generally right direction as opposed to sort of all over the place. And a second kind of system would be state level and broader kind of policy level support for childcare and family leave, right? If you compare the United States on a national level, globally, it's embarrassing. And there are some really interesting state level innovations in California, for example, a small business insurance fund for family leave that makes it affordable for small businesses to do that. I think there's actually a lot of innovation that can be done on the state level as well.
I really like that point about just deeper collaboration. When I think about the climate space, we've known solutions for a long time. Some of the same solutions that we're talking about today are what we've been talking about for 20 years. So how do we kind of build coalitions and political will to move things that we know are in our best interests, and some of that. And that's that coalition building and deeper collaboration. As I said in my remarks, we know that government can't do it all as it relates to the climate space, and especially state government. So how do we kind of partner together, working with thought leaders in business and in academia and other areas to really advance the policies that we know might have some win-wins?
And I'll add on to that and just say that, so when I did my master's project, I focused on the asset-based community development model, if people remember that from earlier in the decade. And so I was always very much about, institutions, working with nonprofits, working with, community. And I think, the challenge with entities like this council and like many problem-solving think tank kind of situations is that the expertise is held within those people that are there, that are doing this high level thinking and understand, the numbers and, economics. Like I dropped out of my economics class after 2 classes because I just couldn't grasp what they were talking about. But, it's like, but the community is never centered, right? We understand the numbers, we understand what the future might be, but in any good community-based research project, you come back to the community and ask them, what do these numbers mean? What does this mean to you? And therefore, what are the recommendations that come out of it? So again, that's kind of part of my background, but that's how I did research, how I would do research if I continued. And I feel like think tanky situations like this council really need to be doing that type of work as well.
Marcus, I see your hand up.
Great, thanks. I wasn't sure if this thing was up or not. I kept pushing it 5 times, but it never shows my hand up. I think those are great comments. This is kind of tied to Jeff's earlier question around engagement, and Juhi, you kind of touched a bit on this a little bit here, but how has your agenda or plan been received by your stakeholders? And are there any lessons learned about how you bring these plans across to these stakeholders? So obviously a lot of listening involved in what you've done, but thinking about, we come up with a great plan here, how do you bring that back to the communities, the various communities that are there, and ensure that there's engagement and adoption of what is being brought forth?
So is that question to me about our area agenda, or to every? Okay.
All of you guys, yeah.
Oh, okay. I would say for our area agenda, our intention was to lift up existing work. So our area being Alliance Regional Equity Agenda, but our intention was to lift up existing agendas, existing work. And so they were already of the community, and we took it as an opportunity to make sure that others and decision makers are also seeing and hearing it.
And was that received well by doing that, or did you encounter any barriers as you brought that plan forward?
I would say we had one. Just to be honest and transparent, we had one person push back on us on it, right? They were like, you took my words and you did this with it and you didn't have my permission. And so, and that goes back to the authenticity and being clear and your intentions. What are you doing with this? When you, as an organizer, you are being charged with people's stories and to bring them forward, so with the belief that you're going to make change with their story, right? That's why they're sharing it. That's the commodity. That's the exchange, and And so this person didn't see themselves literally in what we were doing next, and that was our bad. And so we had to go back and think about how are we ensuring that those that we that we felt like we were doing good by lifting up their voices, but making sure that they continue to be centered, because you can't just take from people, and because then that goes into the exploitation, right? And that's what we were being called out for in this instance by this person. So thank you for having me air that laundry. Just kidding.
We're still in the early phases of our engagement process. So get back to you, but initial feedback has been people are excited to be a part of the work groups. People are excited to have an opportunity to participate in this process and to have their voices heard. But I mean, our ultimate success is going to depend on how we incorporate that and how we change our plan. So more to come, but we hope to land the plane.
Nothing from me, as we don't, we're more just kind of sharing insights. I do wish, though, that kind of groups like this could shift from the insight collection and more to the instigation, innovation, right? What's the spark and what's the new thing that you're going to drive that didn't exist before?
Scott, I see a hand from you.
I guess I have a question for Juhi, which is, what I struggle with is in innovation work and in some of my other change work, people aren't very good at imagining the future that's possible for them. I think of the work of Genesis Works and the fact that you take somebody who really isn't exposed to the types of jobs they could do, and you show them how small the gap is in between. They take high school students and show them how small the gap is between the life they're living and, going in and working in IT or having a professional job. And that leads to very high graduation rates. I don't know the recent numbers, in the first few years of that program, the graduation rates from college of those students was very high, having sort of shown them the potential. And that is a struggle I have with the type of community engagement I see in Minnesota a lot, which is sit around and interview people. And I think it just has to be walking in people's shoes. And I guess I want to go out and study and learn and be a journalist, because I worry that people aren't often good enough at imagining how great their future could be. Obviously, like in my growing up, was like, my great-grandfather was a surgeon, right? So the stories we told ourselves about what was possible made just that imagination come together really well. I've seen people who are ready to be entrepreneurs tomorrow who think they have like a 10-year journey ahead of them, need to get a master's degree. They just need the push and to know that it's possible. So I'm wondering what advice do you have for the group where we could go and really learn what people's lives are like and then help kind of bridge to a future, rather than kind of what is your most current need in your maybe sometimes limited purview of imagining, what your potential is?
I think part of it is that that's not necessarily our job, right? I think that's where leadership development comes about. That's where you find those people in the communities who have the passion, have that spark to imagine something, different and bigger, and then develop their leadership to bring their perspective and their community into the work, right? So it's not about you, Scott, and me, Juhi, becoming expert in the lives of other people, but bringing those people into these conversations. One of the things that I'm always very aware of is that, there's been huge investment in me to be at this table right here. I mean, what do I bring to this table? But because of all the exchanges, experiences, invitations to be part of something that I'm comfortable being in this space somewhat. I won't say entirely, but somewhat. And, whereas other people that, are not, who are people of color, are not going to come to this space because they're not going to know how to get heard. And so there is So we need to change a lot of things in the culture of how we do things like this. But on top of that, we can never be expected to be the expert of somebody else's experience. And so we need to build the leadership that exists in our communities to be a part of these conversations.
Scott, just one other thought, because I think we're talking about this in two different directions. One is, how do the people on this Teams call immerse themselves and fully understand and kind of expand their horizons? I think that's one thing. I think the more exciting question is actually, how do you expand at scale the horizons and aspirations of a broader group of people who might not know there is a different path, as you described. One of the most interesting examples, very similar to the Genesis Works example that you shared, was in a study where kids were taking pre-SATs. They did a randomized control sample, and to one group, they actually sent Stanford University little postcards in the mail, as if like their test score had elicited this outreach. And systematically, that set of students aspired to better, on average, ranked colleges than the control group. That's one example of how do you raise the aspirations of a group at scale. It's not going to be as easy as sending a postcard in the mail, but I think the real question is, how do we do that in different ways, reskilling and retraining and getting them connected to people who do have those IT jobs at scale, different paths. There's now some very interesting analytics work on, if you have this customer service sales skill set, what are the other jobs without additional education or a 4-year or master's degree that you could get to a better paying job, right? And that's kind of that personal pathway could be really interesting. But I think how do you do this at scale is really the most exciting unlock here.
I hate to, I'm not going to monopolize too much more time, but those are really exciting answers. And I will point out that based on similar research to what you just cited, we worked very hard to deploy college savings accounts in St. Paul for every kid. And there was some ridicule. What does a $50, $100 college savings account do? Well, it tells somebody that there's an investment in them going to college. And if it gets 100 kids or 1,000 thinking I'm a future college student, there might be something there. And I know that there's no magic tricks out there, unfortunately, to these, big problems. But I love the thinking of how do you scale belief in possibility and then have the program so that possibility can be realized.
I think I see a hand from Penny.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the conversation. It's a really robust one, so appreciate everybody here. I want to talk a little bit about the reskilling and ask you some questions about how we might think of that differently. It strikes me that there's this things coming together that are pretty amazing right now, right? There's jobs looking for people instead of people looking for jobs. There's this economic opportunity we want, especially for those people who have been left behind, because of systemic barriers that they face. And we've got some money in the state too. So all these things are coming together and we want to do that wisely. So when we think about like reskilling, retooling, how do we think about doing that if in a future facing world for future jobs, and thinking about those social skills that you brought up, Quellen, too, that are going to be needed? So what are some approaches out there that we should maybe be considering that are less traditional and offer more opportunities to more people? Any thoughts on that from the group?
I'll start, and I'm sure many others have thoughts as well. Couple things I think would be really impactful is releasing the constraint that many companies have for a 4-year degree as a criteria for employment. We've seen a lot. I think Bank of America, IBM, Google recently did this. Very exciting. I think JP Morgan was also an early mover to say not just a 4-year degree is not a barrier, but having a record in the past will also not stop you from being employed by JP Morgan. And so thinking about even at a state level, could there be a Minnesota-wide push? Could there be state government support for companies that make bolder actions in that direction? And then you could imagine on top of that, sort of collaborating with educational institutions to embed the social and emotional, skills that we were talking about, more the technology skills in vocational training, right? More targeted certificates as opposed to 4-year or frankly, even 2-year degrees. I think we could do all of that a lot more effectively. One last thought, Walmart, Starbucks, a few others have done some really interesting collaborations with digital schools, with ASU, with others, to give free or dollar per day college programs. They've literally invested billions of dollars in this. And so could we do more of that with our in-state employers, or potentially even at scale in Minnesota? And that, the digital unlock here over the last couple of years could be really powerful.
Quaylen, are you aware of any Minnesota companies that have already started to drop the 4-year degree or modify how they handle people with prison backgrounds?
No, I'm not. No changes in the last couple years that I'm aware of. The changes were sort of pre-COVID, and they were sort of, just in our contact center, you don't have to have a 4-year degree, or in our bank branches, or very targeted jobs, as opposed to across the board for any set of jobs.
Great.
Jeff, I can just say quickly, we have seen an increased amount of interest from the DEED lens of companies who are interested in working with the Department of Corrections on some of our crossover programs there to get recently incarcerated individuals and jobs in their firms. And I think it's an area that deserves a lot more exploration, but it's one that DEED and the Department of Corrections are working on pretty aggressively right now, given the labor shortages. I think one of the other challenges that exists as it relates to reskilling, but it's an opportunity too, is that when you've got, to Penny's point, jobs searching for people and not people searching for jobs, training enrollment always goes down, right? Because people are like, well, I can get a job without any training. And so the unique challenge and opportunity we face right now is, how do you get people reskilling for the jobs of the future that Quaylen has outlined, and convince them that some amount of training will help them longer term at a moment when most employers are saying, give me a warm body. And that's kind of that's a dynamic that I think we face around reskilling, which is surmountable for sure, but it's part of that conversation that employers and government are having together on this stuff, and it's so important.
And I think the key there is to chunk it up and make it much more modular. So it's not a 2-year endeavor, right? It's a much shorter, more targeted effort. And one thought, Steve, because I think this push with the Partnership on Corrections is so inspirational. Recidivism, one of the biggest predictors of recidivism, is coming out of prison without a job lined up. And to Juhi's point earlier, you don't have then a house and an address, and you might not have, a place from before. And so that's, for men at least, that's the biggest predictor of recidivism. And so how do you, when they have all the time in the world before coming out, get in there, train them on these jobs that we need filled with the social and emotional and the technological skills and all these other things, so that they can come out and be ready for a job, more stable home, and get off to a right start?
Right. I mean, something like 2 out of 3 people who are released from prison end up back in there within 5 years. And you're right, a job is the key there. Just quickly, I'll pop this in the chat, but we've been talking to an organization called Concordance Academy that is a really unique approach on this in Indiana, I think, that we've looked at expanding here, because it's ripe for systems change, to the point, Paul, you raised earlier.
And based on our agenda timing, we're going to move on shortly, but Tulea, you've had your hand up, so let's go ahead with that first.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak to the method of communication to your work, knowing that our news and media outlets in outstate are shoring up, and the broadband, the significance of broadband in your work.
I'll describe some of the aspects. I think in the American Opportunity Survey insights that we looked at, kind of the urban-rural divide was quite stark, and you see that pretty much across all of the research, I think, from different angles. And so broadband access across the whole state, including more rural areas, is going to be a key unlock to jobs, right? You can't join a Teams meeting, you can't do reskilling on a regular basis if you don't have regular, reliable broadband access. So I think that is a critical issue across the entire state, particularly in rural areas. And then kind of sharing that, I know some of our local companies have made that their number one issue, but driving that, I think, and communicating kind of the priorities that are serving rural needs, I think would help with some of the communication and access there.
I would just add, we also see broadband as an important way to drive down greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, right? People have to drive less if you can join a virtual meeting like the one we're in today, and that's a good thing overall from the environment. So we see it as not just something that raises up jobs, but it's also environmentally friendly.
Yeah, I don't have a response for regional.
And then I have just one more tail question for the MPCA. When you do your outreach, is there a prioritization of the coal-free communities, regions of Minnesota?
We have, for the framework, really kind of tried to prioritize anyone who might have expertise in this opportunity. So that's transitioning communities who might be a coal-fired power plant community who will be transitioning out of it, but other communities in greater Minnesota as well, and then paying particular attention to trying to increase diversity of lived experiences too. So we haven't necessarily focused on one because we're trying to cast as broad a net as possible for engagement on this framework, but really lifting up diverse voices and people who have different lived experiences.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Quaylin and Craig for joining us, and thank Juhi for performing double duty today. We really appreciate your input, and now we're going to have a chance to do our breakout groups and talk further about what you provide us this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes, thanks everyone. Great conversation, really inspiring. Excited to transition into this next part. So Angie, if you want to put us in breakout rooms, that would be great. And I am going to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat.
All right, you're all on your way.
else then from the three groups? Anyone want to volunteer their group and to start?
I'm happy to go. I think it's group 2, Paul's group. So we had a good discussion. Obviously, a lot of insights we picked up earlier. Couple of things we talked about, maybe more than others. One is Commissioner Harpstead was talking about the, examples of childcare models in other countries there at the end, like Germany, where they maybe go further with it. And that was a little bit of a reaction to some discussion about, we can talk about incenting employers to provide childcare, but it's going to be hard to have kind of a moonshot, really aggressive program that sort of does incremental incentives and hopes the private sector carries it along. And in some of these areas, and maybe childcare is one, we need to just think about ways to go bigger. And if Germany's figured it out, that's certainly worth considering. And then the other thing that came up was just, all the insight we get about the whole person. And, Paul was telling his story about, kind of leaving the inner city and going to a high-end private school and opening his mind towards what the future could hold for him. And I think his life trajectory tells its own story. So you think about all of the people we have for whom it's not just childcare, it's not just healthcare, it's not just reskilling, it's not just belief in themselves, it's not just safety in their community or housing, it's so many things. And we just feel like I think our group really had consensus about the fact that solutions we come up with need to consider the whole person in a way that's really cohesive.
Very good.
I can go. I'm group 1, Jeff's group. Yeah, same. We had a really great, robust conversations. Some of the ideas and solutions that we had thought about, and I hope I'm able to talk about this. There's a lot. One is just around, centering policies that actually support women. So, for example, things around not asking your salary history. It is illegal in certain states now. Personally, I think things around paid medical family leave and salary transparency, all those things certainly do impact women and ultimately will support everyone all around in terms of bridging the gap around pay equity. We also talked about just credentialing or recognizing the lived experiences for, especially, let's say, for women who have been staying at home for the past 2 years due to the effects of the pandemic. That's certainly not necessarily new because of the pandemic. A lot of women have lost opportunities for career advancement because of the fact that they had to choose to be a caregiver at home. And so are there ways for us to be able to provide some sort of skill acknowledgement, because staying at home is still very challenging. It's a job. And then I think it's just really important for us to mention the fact that there is still a piece around stability for folks. You need to have stable housing, you need to have stable childcare, healthcare, et cetera. We also wanted to make sure that things that are going to impact the communities, the folks in those communities have an input into that. So here, great, we were presented with all these different numbers and statistics. What do the folks in those communities think about them? If there are going to be lack of jobs in certain communities, do those folks know that their jobs might be automated in the next 5 to 10 years? Paid internships that support entry into full-time employment. Also making it easier path for individuals who have international degrees, with recognizing the fact that sometimes challenging is we can't find residency and that's part of the requirement. Anything else that I missed from this group? I think I covered it most. Good.
Great job. Thank you. And the third group.
We neglected to hire or to appoint someone to speak on our behalf. I don't know if Talia, Joe, or Marcus want to speak up for us. I could cover too, but we forgot to assign somebody. Why don't I dive in, and if you guys want to fill anything in, we can. We'll appoint a speaker next time. We had a good conversation. Focused a lot on automation and the effect that it is going to have on our economy, and the need to reskill in the face of that. And really a good discussion there on some of the data that Quayleen brought up. Talked about reskilling and just the challenges of doing it right and of getting people engaged and focused. We kind of harken back to the data from Deed's office, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that showed that people made the most money when they went back to their original job coming off of UI versus going to a new one. And the only difference in making that trend line change is if you reskill to a job that has a higher pay grade and more opportunity. So that's kind of the headwinds you face in that space, but an important one. And then a good conversation around kind of energy transition in some of the communities in Minnesota that are facing the closure of coal plants and what it means to shift to what's next, and what training or opportunity creation is needed there, and how that's a pretty holistic issue that tees off on a lot of different components, from childcare to housing to skill development to the actual labor force is going to do those new jobs, in addition to the need to create those new jobs when a big plant like that closes down. We touched on broadband and its importance to all of this, and kind of the rural voice there. And team, what am I missing? I think that touches some of the main themes anyway.
Good job, Steve.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Joe.
All right, well, very good. Thanks to all the groups for their input there. We're now going to kind of show the approach to the council of how we're going to handle the next few weeks. This approach is to support the gathering of relevant information by subcommittee and to allow them to complete their section of the roadmap. You know, we'll continue to have weekly presenters and panelists, but we are going to utilize what's on the screen there as our 5 subcommittees. I want to thank a couple of folks for being willing to be flexible, and in a couple cases agreeing to take their second choice, just so we could balance the things out a little more evenly. So thank you for the sacrifice there. So our next 5 meetings are going to actually rotate between the subcommittees. Maybe we can go to the next slide. And each subcommittee is responsible for hosting a meeting on a given day, including the selection of presenters for that day, with a goal of sharing cross-cutting insights to the council as a whole. And the format for the meeting will basically be roughly, for these next few meetings, so an hour will be, so health equity on March 14th. They're in charge of basically the first hour, a set of presenters, a couple set of presenters. They can mix in input back and forth however they want to do that. And then roughly the second hour, we're also going to utilize this time for subcommittees to work together. So we're trying to kind of minimize the requirement that we have a lot of meetings outside of the schedule, although we certainly can do some of that. There will be, after these are done, and you can see kind of on the chart there, we're going to have on April 25th kind of a chance to also share the progress with the other subcommittees and cross-pollinate potentially. And then you're going to be asked, even starting today, to kind of talk with your fellow subcommittee members to communicate about the people and organizations that you might want to gather information from, and also maybe even being able to attend existing meetings within the networks that you have. So in other words, you know, rather than all of the work of the council being required to be outreach or bringing people in formally as presenters, that maybe we can either in person or virtually kind of go to folks who are already having meetings on these topics, and maybe 1 or 2 of us participate and then report back to the group. Liz, what else should we share about the process here?
No, I think that's great. I think you covered it. Are we ready to break into our subcommittees and get working on it? I can show every group will kind of be working through these 3 components. Your facilitators will help you do this. So Angie, if you want to start putting the people into their subcommittees, go ahead, and I'll just introduce this briefly. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do is look at the roadmap and review and approve what the vision statement is, and then do some planning for the meeting that you're responsible for hosting. So starting with why you want to get people together, what's really cross-cutting here, and 1 or 2 presenters. I think no more than 3, because it's hard to digest a lot of information. And then, like Jeff said, getting into that, who are we talking to outside of council time? What else do we need to know, and who do we need to hear from? So yeah, we're gonna split into the breakout groups and work through this, and then we'll briefly come together and close.
Very good.
You will be on your way in just a second. If I accidentally renamed the group that you show up in, I'm getting you all in the right groups with the right people, but I might have accidentally renamed them wrong. So roll with the name of your breakout room is what I'm saying there. So it'll be just a couple minutes here.
fine.
Okay. Well, Lizzie was saying kind of one of the key things you really wanted to get out of here was honing in on the vision statements. Was that something we wanted to finalize? And I guess, obviously it would have been preferable to be able to have these discussions with the subcommittees responsible for those groups, but we, I guess, could try to carry on and do that as a big group, just kind of go through them one at a time and accept input, honestly, from anybody on that. And then that may help that part of the exercise. And then otherwise, in terms of obviously the mission had been a chance for the new committee members to touch base and think about presenters and timing and whatever. And it's just, that's just not going to happen today. We'll have to do that when we have the breakout at the next session. We're probably really disadvantaging the poor health group that has to go first. You guys honestly may have to have some sort of other meeting on the side, I think, before your official meeting 2 weeks from now when you're in charge of the half of the agenda.
Penny and I had a brief conversation this morning. We were really looking forward to talking to Talia this afternoon, and I'm looking for another way to find her. So.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Commissioner Harpsted, do you feel like your group will be able to be ready for the 14th?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I see some of you have made it into this where this is located on our teams. And yes, thank you, Carrie, for putting the link in the chat so that hopefully everyone can access it. And like we mentioned briefly last time, staff looked at all of these vision statements across the board and tried to write and reframe them in similar language compared to each other, and also that's what created the addition of the business one, because it was a gap that was identified, so that was pulled out of the initial vision statement and placed in its own category. Another thing that Commissioner Grove spearheaded was this theme addresses, and that was sort of another layer in terms of scoping what the conversations in the individual groups might be. So I think, yeah, we can start with this one. You can see the original and the suggested update. And I guess the primary audience for this question is the group that is working on this, but does anyone have, should we go with the suggested update, or is there a minor tweak that we would like to make to it?
We were all good with the new statement, and had just kind of we actually were able to kind of connect. So we were, Nanoko, Joe, and I were maybe the lucky ones, but our group worked. But so we like where the statement ended up, and we're just kind of starting to dig into the issues and pick them apart in our conversation. But Jeff, Nanoko, what would you add anything to that?
Well,
super far
from my side of it, Nanoko had made a comment where she had caught that the vision statement actually was, we accepted the recommendation and thought that was better, right? So that says for community or a place to feel like you belong, and we just took this suggested update. I'm not sure if that matters for this or not, to make sure that that everybody knows that, but.
Edit completed. On to the next one. Health equity. I nicknamed you. Okay, so I nicknamed the first group Minnesota characteristics, and I've nicknamed the second group Health equity. Please change your nickname if you don't like it. So Penny, Talia, Commissioner Harpsted.
So we did not land in the room together. So, but Commissioner Harpsted, you had some thoughts about, how we would parallel that with our earlier discussions with some of the CDC recommendations. So I wonder if you might speak to it.
Yeah, this came to us when Jody Hubler actually was in a meeting with us and looked up the CDC commitment to equity, and they were the ones that came up with this notion of full potential. And I was just looking at the statement on their website, and their statement would be just the perfect vision for us. And maybe we should just copy it and say in Minnesota. It's very close to the suggested update. So we're close. I think we might just tweak ours a little bit, but I think we're fairly close. One of the things that Penny and I talked about this morning was our group on the original Post-it note map also had the issue of the caring professions workforce. So in addition to individual Minnesotans achieving their full health potential, we also have the healthcare workforce to worry about, and that's a different issue. But I think we need to address both in our group, and we had some great recommendations for speakers that could do that. So as soon as we get a chance to talk to Talia, I hope we can come up with that list of speakers for the next meeting, and off we go.
Thank you. BIPOC businesses and communities.
Are you scrolling down to the, oh, here we go. Okay. Wait, is this the health one? Oh, wait, here we go.
And I know Paul maybe had some thoughts on when we were editing this and when the executive planning team was editing this. So I don't know, Paul, if you want to weigh in.
I can't recall how I weighed in previously. I felt it was important to pull out and call out BIPOC communities, which previously hadn't been in there. Yeah, I just can't remember. Do you remember?
No, that was your edit. That was your addition. So
Great.
That's what I was tracking.
Yeah.
So I just have one question on it. I guess it's not our groups, but our group's the next one with business. The words "and entrepreneurs." I mean, so I mean, we obviously our group didn't have a chance to meet, but here I have, Scott and Jody are both very talented, experienced folks in the entrepreneurial space, and I didn't know if it splits it up to kind of throw entrepreneurs up in group 3, or if it would make more sense to not be up there, and therefore when you're talking about wanting to grow and create businesses, that's what entrepreneurs do, that maybe those words belong more in group 4, but that's just throwing that out there.
Yeah,
the rest of this was about small business growth versus business overall, which is why the word entrepreneurs was there, but curious others' feedback on that one.
So I think in this group when the first was created, I'm not sure, because I think it had also to do with workforce development and some of the training programs, if I'm not mistaken. If I am mistaken, then maybe that's somewhere else. But I thought that we had a discussion around, and maybe that's a different group. This isn't looking as familiar to me as I thought it did in terms of what the issue themes are.
What is the business, the next one, like what do they look like side by side?
Yeah, I'll copy and paste this up.
Well, yeah, which group is the group that is focusing on training programs, and is that this one with workforce development?
To me, number 3 definitely is it's sort of, I took it as sort of that's the employee side and making sure that we enrich and train and invest and so forth. And then the other was kind of like, okay, the business creation and growth side, but that's.
Yeah, Juhi has a question in the chat that I kind of want the group to wrestle with, because I think it's a valid one. And to your point too, Jeff, is our workforce and businesses split now? And also this, the BIPOC communities, it's a slightly different flavor. Like it's doing, there's maybe 3 things happening here. So.
I mean, maybe, well, while we're thinking
I would
about
say,
this, go ahead.
I would say that I'm okay if they split, because I think everything is supposed to be comprehensive and intersectional regardless. So if it does split, I don't feel like it's siloed and isolated.
If we do if we do split it, I would put BIPOC in both, because I don't know that you would have one without the other. And the way that this reason, I know there's probably some edits last meeting that I missed, but it seems like we kind of created a catch-all here now for BIPOC community versus like being intentional. But this one seems like it would be workforce.
Well, and there's a huge part of workforce that happens in the realm that has nothing to do with business. So I think that is important to consider as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's the equation, right? Like you have to have the communities working together to get people ready, and then the business parts making the pathways into the businesses. And so if we talk about workforce, are we talking about the supply side of, creating opportunity, and then the business side is working on the demand side of, creating opportunity?
Yeah, I think Juhi's point about is equity a horizontal or a vertical is kind of gets to the heart of this. Like, we'd think that equity would be strewn across all 5 areas, not just one. The reason that we had BIPOC listed here and entrepreneurs listed here, as the teams all went over it, is that there was a distinct interest in BIPOC business growth, and the fact that if we're going to make the kind of changes that the state needs, we need to have a laser focus on Black and brown people starting businesses. And so that's, I think, why entrepreneurship remained in here and BIPOC was called out, is kind of at the heart of what this group was discussing originally. I think it's fine if the group wants to shift to workforce versus workforce in one and business in the other. But the number 4 was a bit more about like business attraction and incentives and tax policy and getting the next, the next big companies to come. And so that was the thinking behind how these were set out, but we can certainly shift having a kind of a workforce themed one and a business one. But didn't want to lose that from the feeling of kind of Black and brown small businesses being like a really critical area for the group not to lose focus on.
I think to the point that Quaylen made earlier, though, is that we don't want to like isolate BIPOC businesses. We would want to have some of that horizontal, because if we're creating, and I think this goes back to the earlier conversation in the fall around the tax incentives around the angel tax credit and making sure the focus is where it needs to be, because it's not being utilized the way or maximized the way that it could be. So to me, if we split it, then we got to make equity if we're not specific plan in the middle here.
I mean, my instinct would be to go with what Marcus is saying. Again, our group didn't have a chance to talk, but one of the things I was hoping to talk with them about is, okay, if you think about presenters, it's like, yeah, we can have CEOs from some of the major companies, whatever, but we also ought to have BIPOC owned businesses. We ought to be hearing what is and isn't working from their perspective in terms of the support. And so I don't know, maybe that break of, and on the flip side, it's like not everybody's going to start a business. Not everybody wants to start a business. So there are all sorts of people for skilling and other reasons that do need, that we ought to be focused on, that has nothing to do with them starting a business. So, maybe there is kind of the worker side and there's the business side, but both ought to have the direct BIPOC reference that Marcus is talking about.
Yeah, and Jeff, Scott and I did have, poor Commissioner Harpstead got a chance to sit in, but we did meet.
Good.
And we did focus on that start, grow, and expand. And, Scott's was to take in the country, because we also talk a lot about, we're trying to do a lot that is attracting, we have Israeli-based companies coming in, we have companies from Australia coming in. I mean, we were recommending in the country. And we spent a lot of time talking about and being influenced by some of the work that we've done inside of Launch Minnesota, where it actually is BIPOC, women, vets, and the opportunity for that expansion starts to come out. So I think one of the things that I'm kind of influenced a little bit by the conversation with Juhi and what Commissioner Grove just mentioned is that if we were wanting to be targeted on that, we were focused on our BIPOC populations and the expansion and starting of BIPOC specific businesses. I do think there's a space that leaves that it is about the broader policies that invite, that isn't at the exclusion of the intentionality. But once we start to say that it's then BIPOC is mentioned here, we had the issue of our, we just talked about our inmates, women. We will end up with a series of commas. So I think we need to be intentional where we need to be intentional, but I think we need to also make sure that we're focusing on some of the meta themes as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm not as following as clearly. Well, did you and Scott have some specific other language you thought needed to be
literally the only thing? No, the only thing we were recommending is to take out in the country. We were not limiting. I mean, part of it to focus on is there is global business that is coming to Minnesota because of our ag, our health tech, and some of our other focused ecosystem. And we actually felt that in the country was limiting. It needs to be expansive.
So we have just 1 minute left, and I want to give Group 5 a couple seconds.
Yes, I'll be quick here. We're actually going to try and find some time. We got to go back. We started talking about the vision statement. One, we see overlap obviously between the different vision statements, which is part of what's being talked about here. Challenge of our statement is it's kind of the catch-all for everything that didn't quite cluster somewhere else. We're going to have to work with that. And then on the vision statement itself, we felt that one, it felt a little bit overemphasized on infrastructure and feels like it draws the reader more to, buildings and roads and bridges, than it does people. And so we want to add on the very end of it, we want to add something that says all Minnesotans. One, to emphasize the people element of this, but we're also going to revisit this a little bit. We'll find some time in the next week to come together as a small group to do some continued revisions on this.
Thanks everyone for being flexible with the technical difficulties. Really appreciate hanging in there. Thanks for continuing.
I mean, I guess we're at our 2 o'clock time and we want to be respectful for people's times. I think realistically, then we'll hope to have finalized vision statements at the outset of the next meeting, but we can't walk out of here today with them. So,
yeah.
Very good. And thank you to the health group for being the guinea pig and taking on the initial challenge of hosting the meeting next time. So,
great. Thank you all.
Good to see everybody.
Thanks everybody.